In the spring of 1986, a loan officer named Glenn Voss sat at Maren Holt's kitchen table in Pottawatomie County, Kansas, looked at her thin, diversified fields and her 3 missed payments. He was 48. He had a degree in agricultural finance from a good school, and he was not a cruel man. He believed what the spreadsheet in front of him told him, which was that a widow of 33, running 240 acres of unfashionable mixed cropping, could not survive the year. 18 months later, in the fall of 1987, Maren Holt signed the deed to the neighboring quarter section, 400 acres in all, paid in cash while the man who had owned it before her watched from his truck. Between those 2 moments lies the whole story, and it is a story about 2 kinds of knowing. Let me tell you about Maren Holt, because the woman Glenn Voss saw across that table was not the woman who actually lived on that ground. He saw a young widow in a faded work coat, a kitchen that had not been updated since her husband's father owned the place, and a checkbook 3 payments behind. He did not see what she knew he could not have. Knowledge like hers does not show up on a balance sheet, and a man trained to read balance sheets had never been taught to look for it. She was known for 2 things in that county. She was quiet, to the point that strangers thought her slow, and she could read a field the way some people read weather coming. People who had farmed beside her for years told a story about the summer of 1981, when she had walked into a neighbor's wheat at the edge of the road, crouched, broke a head open in her palm, and told him he had rust coming through the low end before a single agronomist in the county had named it. She had been 28 then. The neighbor had laughed her off and lost the low 40. That was the kind of knowing she carried, and it was exactly the kind a man with a folder could not see. Her husband Tom had died the previous October, when his tractor rolled on the creek slope, on a wet morning when he had taken the old Ford down a grade he had taken 1,000 times. She had found him herself. The county had watched her since with the particular pity reserved for women who would surely have to give up. Casseroles left on the porch the first weeks, then nothing, then the slow turning away of people who assume a thing is already decided. The bank watched, too. The note on home quarter was a 5-year balloon Tom had signed in 1984, a structure that asked for small payments for 4 years, and then the whole weight at once, and the kind of loan a man signs when he believes the good years will keep coming. Grief had cost her 2 months of attention she could not afford, 2 months when the checkbook sat unopened on the counter, and the payments slid past. She was behind, 3 of them, and everyone knew she was behind, and the kindest thing the neighbors could imagine was that she would get a fair price before the auction and move to town and be looked after. None of them had walked her fields. If they had, they might have understood what the bank never did, that the woman they pitied was sitting on the most resilient ground in the county and simply had not been given a season to prove it. Glenn Voss came out on a Tuesday in late April with his clean boots and his folder. He drove a white sedan that had never been off pavement until it hit her gravel drive, and he parked it carefully away from the mud. He sat where Tom used to sit, in the chair with the worn arm, and he did not know he had chosen it. He spread the numbers across the oilcloth, columns of them, the amortization and the projected income against the county standard yields, and he spoke gently, because gentleness was how he had been taught to deliver bad arithmetic. He had done this many times. He believed he was good at it, and in a way he was. "This is a hobby operation, Mrs. Holt," he said. "I don't say that to be unkind. You've got 6 different things growing out there, and not enough of any one of them to matter at the elevator. The men who are making it now are planting fence to fence, 1 crop, getting their volume up, selling into the contracts. That's where the efficiency is. You're farming like it's 1940. He turned to Paige. He had a way of tapping the figure he wanted her to look at, the deficit, the gap between what the ground would bring at standard yields and what the note required. You see this number? Has. There's no version of the year where this number works. I can get you out clean, get you a fair price at auction before the foreclosure forces it, and you walk away with something instead of nothing. That's the smart play. That's me looking out for you. She had let him talk the whole way through. She refilled his cup when it got low, and she looked at his columns the way a person looks at a language they can read but do not respect. When he finished, she did not raise her voice, and she did not spread papers of her own, because she had none that would have meant anything to him. Tom's father planted it this way for a reason, she said. It's held this family through 1956 and through the 80s so far. It'll hold. That was all. She did not explain the rotation because she had already learned that explaining it to a man like Glenn only deepened his certainty that she was sentimental. She walked him to the door. Glenn drove back to town believing he had done a sad but necessary thing, and on his desk calendar he wrote a note to check the foreclosure timeline in 90 days. If you have ever sat across from someone certain you were finished, you know the particular quiet of that kitchen after the truck pulled away. Tell me in a comment whether you have. Then she put her coat on and went back out to the fields, and the old border collie rose from the porch and went with her, because the fields did not care what the bank thought, and neither in the end did she. Let me tell you what those 6 different things were, because the diversity Glenn dismissed as a hobby was the entire engine of the thing. Tom's father, a man named Albert, who had come to Kansas from a hard valley in the old country as a boy, had refused to plant the home quarter to a single crop his whole life. He had arrived in this country with nothing but a sack of seed his own father had pressed on him at the dock, wheat that had grown in a place where the weather was never kind twice in a row, and he had carried the lesson of that hard valley into the easy Kansas years and never let it go. He kept the ground in a rotation. Almost nobody else ran anymore. Winter wheat one year, then a legume to feed the soil, then a row crop, then a year where the ground rested under deep-rooted grass and the cattle worked it before the cycle began again. 4 phases run across the fields in strips and blocks, so that in any given summer the farm was doing all 4 things at once. Albert had written down why in a black ledger he kept in the kitchen drawer, dates and rainfall and yields in a cramped hand, going back to 1949, and Maren had read that ledger so many times the spine had given out, and she had sewn it back together with waxed thread. The principle was simple, and the bank had no column for it. A field planted to one crop every year, fence to fence, takes the same things out of the soil in the same place every season, and the soil thins where you cannot see it thinning. The roots all reach to the same depth and pull from the same shelf of moisture. The insects and the diseases that love that one crop learn the field and come back richer every year, so you spend more each season holding them off. You prop the whole thing up with purchased nitrogen and purchased poison, and as long as the rain comes on time and the price holds, and the chemicals keep working, you look like the smartest farmer in the county, and the diversified neighbor looks like a fool. Albert had written one sentence at the top of the first page, underlined twice, and Maren could have recited it in her sleep. A field that depends on everything going right will fail the first year something goes wrong. Maren understood that sentence in her hands, not just her head. She knew which of her fields held water in a dry July and which shed it down the slope, knew it from walking them barefoot as a young wife when Albert was still alive and teaching. She knew that the legumier put nitrogen back into the ground for nothing, drawn down out of the air by bacteria living on the roots, so that she bought a fraction of the fertilizer her neighbors hauled in by the ton. She knew the grass and cattle year rebuilt the soil, the animals trampling old growth flat into the dirt and dunging it and leaving it darker and deeper than they had found it, a thing no bag of anything could buy. And she knew the part the bank would have called superstition, if she had been foolish enough to say it aloud, which was that her 6 different things could not all fail in the same week, because no single force in the sky or the market could strike wheat and legume and row crop and grass and cattle all at once. The bank saw scatter and inefficiency. She saw insurance that cost her nothing and paid out in every weather God sent. Let me tell you about Royce Temple, because no story like this is complete without the neighbor who did everything right and was punished for it. Royce farmed the quarter section just west of Marin's, 400 acres of his own, and he was good at it in the way the county admired and put on the cover of the cooperative newsletter. He was 40, ambitious, the president of the local Growers Association, and he had listened to every word men like Glen Voss said and believed all of it, because all of it had been true so far in his farming life. He had come up in the good years. He had never farmed through a bad one as the man in charge. In 1985, he had torn out his fence lines, bulldozed the old grass waterways his own father had left in, plowed under the windbreak strips, and planted the whole place to corn, fence to fence, the way the extension bulletins and the seed reps and the men at the elevator all drew it up. Clean, efficient, legible to every measure the modern world used. In the spring of 1986, while Glen was at Marin's table telling her she was finished, Royce drove a brand-new self-propelled sprayer into his own yard, a machine that had cost him $91,000, financed over 7 years at the going rate, and he was not wrong to be proud of it. It was a genuinely fine machine, tall and yellow and gleaming, and it could cover his whole operation in a single day. Where his father had needed a week, he had the numbers worked out on the back of an envelope. At standard yields, the corn would service the machine, the land, and the inputs, and still leave him ahead. And at standard yields, he was right. Everything he had done was correct, provided the years stayed the kind of years he had always known. He stopped by Marin's place that May, friendly, a little pitying, the way a man is gentle with a neighbor he assumes is on the way out. He leaned on her fence and looked at her fields, the strips of different greens, the wheat already heading, and the grass standing thick, where by his lights corn should have been making him money. He shook his head slow. "You ought to clean that up, Marin," he said, not unkindly. "I say it as a friend. All that grass out there, that's just ground you're not getting paid on. That's acres sitting idle. I cleared mine, every foot of it, and you should see the stand I've got coming up, thickest corn I ever planted." He meant well. That is the thing about this whole story that has to be said plainly and kept in front of you the whole way through. Royce was not a fool, and he was not a villain. He was a careful, hard-working, intelligent man, following careful, intelligent advice, and the advice was sound as long as the years stayed ordinary. Marin told him the grass paid in ways the elevator did not weigh. He smiled at that, the way you smile at a child, and he drove home to his beautiful, thick corn, and neither of them yet knew that the sky had already decided to settle the argument between them. Then Tom's nephew came home, and the story got its skeptic. His name was Wade, 24, Tom's brother's boy, and he had just finished a degree in agronomy at the state university, with the kind of grades that get a young man recruited by seed companies. He came back that spring to help his widowed aunt through the worst year of her life, and he arrived genuinely embarrassed by her fields. He loved her. He had spent boyhood summers on that place. He had also spent 4 years, though, learning the modern science of yield, of inputs and outputs, of finding the single limiting factor and pushing on it, of maximizing one variable until it gave you everything it had. And through that lens, Maren's farm looked to him like a museum exhibit, a thing to be respected. He waited a week before he said it. They were standing at the edge of the legume field on a soft May evening, the dog lying in the grass behind them, and Wade could not hold it any longer. "Aunt Maren, I have to be honest with you. This is leaving money in the dirt. I ran the numbers on the drive out here. The math is the math. If you put the legume ground and the grass ground into wheat and corn like everyone else, you could nearly double your cropped acres. That deficit the bank's worried about. That closes. I can show you the spreadsheet." He had charts rolled up in his bag. He had a future mapped out for her in figures, and every figure was correct inside the world he had been taught. And he sided, quietly and with love, with the man from the bank. Maren did not give him a speech because she did not have speeches in her, and because she had learned that arguing only hardened a young man's certainty the way it had hardened Glenn's. She reached into the kitchen drawer that night and handed him Albert's black ledger and told him to read it after supper, year at a time, and to pay attention to the rainfall columns. In the daytime, she put him to work. Let me tell you about that summer, because the demonstration was the slow heart of the whole thing, and it converted a trained skeptic one morning at a time. She had Wade walk the fields with her at dawn every day, before the heat, while the dog ranged ahead of them through the wet grass. She did not lecture. She showed. When they pulled a legume plant, she held the roots up to the light and made him look at the little pale nodules clustered along them, swollen like seed pearls. "Pull one open," she said. He did, and the inside was pink as blood. That color means it's working. Those are bugs living on the root, and they pull nitrogen out of the air and feed it to the plant. And when the plant dies, it leaves the nitrogen in the ground for next year's crop. Albert paid for that field once, 60 years ago, with a sack of seed. It's been making its own fertilizer ever since. Wade knew the biology. He had a chapter on nitrogen fixation in a textbook in his bag. He had never once held it in his hand, and watched a thrifty woman count it as money. She made him dig a spade of soil from the grass field and a spade from the bare, packed dirt along the county road, and hold the two side by side over a feed sap. Her soil was nearly black, and it broke into soft crumbs, and it held together when he squeezed it. And it smelled like a thing that was alive. The roadside dirt was the color of weak coffee and ran through his fingers like flour and smelled like nothing at all. Tom's father called the good one a sponge, she said. You pour an inch of rain on the sponge and it drinks it and keeps it. You pour an inch on that other and it runs off down the ditch and takes the topsoil with it. The bank can't measure a sponge. There's no line for it. But the sponge is the difference between a farm and a dust cloud. And one of these years, you'll watch it be the difference. Wade wrote sponge in the back of his notebook. He did not yet know he was keeping a record of his own conversion. There was a dog in all of this, an old border collie named Pip, who had been Tom's and was now hers, the last living thing on the place that had loved her husband, and he walked every field with them and lay in the shade at the headland while Maren taught and Wade resisted. Wade noticed something in the middle of July, in the worst of the heat, and it stuck with him because he could not explain it away. The dog always lay down on the grass strips and never on the bare ground between the corn rows on Royce's side of the fence, even when the corn ground had better shade. He asked her why. Marin did not even look over. Cooler there. There? Bah. Roots hold the moisture, and the moisture holds the cool. There's 10 degrees of difference between that grass and that bare dirt, and the dog can feel every one of them through his belly. He knows it. TB. He's not reading a chart, he's reading the ground. Wade put his own hand flat on the grass, then reached over the fence and put it on the bare corn ground, and felt the 10 degrees and went quiet. It was the first thing his aunt had told him that all 4 years of his education could not contradict. The spring stayed wet, and Royce's corn came up thick and beautiful, and for a while it looked as though every credentialed voice in the county was right, and the quiet widow was simply too stubborn to read the obvious. Glen Voss drove past in May and saw Royce's uniform green stand running to the horizon, and saw Marin's patchwork of crops and grass, and what he felt was a renewed and gentle certainty. He stopped at a coffee shop in town and said, to no one in particular and to everyone, that the Holt place was a shame, that the woman was farming a memory. The phrase traveled. By June, the county had a way of describing Marin's operation, and the word they used was sentimental. Let me tell you what came down out of the sky that summer, because the weather did not consult the experts. The rain stopped in the 3rd week of June, 1986, and it did not come back. By the middle of July, the temperature sat above 100 for 9 straight days, and the wind out of the southwest came hot and steady, and took the moisture out of everything it touched. The old men in the county started saying a word they had not said since the 50s, drought. It settled over the whole region, and it did not lift, and it began, slowly, and then not slowly, to sort the farmers of Pottawatomie County into 2 kinds. Royce's corn was the first to show it, and it showed it all at once, which was the whole terrible point. Corn is thirsty and shallow-rooted, and his had been planted, fence to fence, with nothing beside it, no grass to break the wind, no deep roots to hold the soil, no other crop on a different clock to spread the risk across the season. So when the water stopped, the entire 400 acres began to fail together, in step, because it was all the same plant, with the same needs reaching to the same shallow shelf of moisture that was no longer there. By the last week of July, his fields had curled and gone the color of old dollar bills, the leaves rolling tight as cigars against the sun, trying to save themselves. He ran the $91,000 sprayer across them twice, with everything the chemical dealer would sell him, and it did exactly nothing, because there is no chemical that is rain. He stood at the edge of the field one evening with Wade, who had walked over out of plain neighborliness, and Royce kept saying it would come back. "One good storm," he said, "one good 3-inch rain, and she straightens right up. I've seen it." His confidence outlasted his corn by a month. The corn knew before. He did the dismissive word, came around again in August, and this time it came from the bank, in fear. Glen Voss had a dozen loans burning up in that drought, and the regional office above him was calling daily, and a frightened, sincere man is harder than a comfortable one. He drove out to Marin's a second time, and he did not bother with the gentle voice. He sat at the same table, and he said it plain. "Mrs. Holt, I respect the sentiment. I truly do. But sentiment does not make a loan payment, and half this county is burning to the ground out there. I need you to be realistic about what this dirt is worth before it is worth nothing at all. This is exactly the year I warned you about. He was not wrong that the county was burning. He was wrong about whose ground was burning, because he had driven past her fields at 40 miles an hour and never once gotten out and put his hand on the difference. Marin let him finish, the way she always did. Then she said she would have his 3 back payments by the 1st of October in full, and she stood and walked him to the door. The old dog followed him out and sat in the gravel drive and watched the white sedan until it was gone over the rise, and only then went back to the porch. Marin's fields did not all fail, and that was the entire argument made visible, and it took Wade most of August to understand the size of what he was watching. Her winter wheat had been cut in early July, before the worst of the heat, harvested and hauled and sold with money already in the bank, because winter wheat matures early and walks out of the field before August can kill it, a thing Albert had chosen on purpose 70 years before Wade was born. The legume field, with roots that went down 4 feet and more, reached water. The corn shallow roots could never touch, and it held green into the dry. The grass field, the wasted ground Royce had pitied, the cool strip where the old dog lay through the worst afternoons, stayed alive on the moisture its deep perennial roots and its spongy black soil had banked from the spring. She lost some, she lost part of the row crop, and she culled cattle early to save grass, and anyone who tells you the old way loses nothing in a true drought is selling you something. Yet she did not lose everything in the same week, and Royce did. And the difference between losing some and losing all is the difference between a hard year and a finished one. Let me tell you about Wade in those weeks, because his turning was the thing that let the reveal land with its full weight. He had stopped arguing in late July. By August, he was the one rising before dawn without being told, walking the fences alone, digging his own comparison spades, and not needing her there to read them. He read Albert's ledger by lamp now after she had gone to bed, and he found in the cramped hand the entry for 1956, another drought, the worst the old man had ever recorded, and beside the rainfall figure Albert had written what the diversified place had carried through it. The same story, 30 years older, in the same drawer the whole time. Wade understood at last what 4 years of school had aimed him away from. The science was real. It had simply been pointed at the wrong question. "We were taught to optimize the average year," he said one night at the table half to himself, reaching for the only word his training had given him. "Maximize the expected yield." Nobody ever stood up and said, "Plan for the worst year you'll ever see." Marin did not look up from the mending in her lap. "The worst year is the only one worth planning for," she said. "The good years take care of themselves. It's the bad one that decides whether you keep the farm." The structural shock did its final sorting in dollars by September, and the arithmetic was clean and merciless. The county average, corn, yield, that ruined year came in at 31 bushels to the acre, less than a third of a normal crop. And on a fence-to-fence corn operation carrying a fresh 7-year note on a sprayer, 31 bushels was not a setback. It was a slow drowning with the date already set. Royce had 400 acres of exactly that. His gross from the burnt corn would not cover the chemical bill he had run up trying to save it. Never mind the machine payment of roughly $13,000 a year. Never mind the land note sitting under all of it like a stone. Marin, on the very same rainfall across one wire fence, had wheat money banked since July, a legume crop that had held cattle she had wintered on grass that greened back with the first fall moisture, and a feed bill near zero because she had grown every mouthful herself. She wrote Glenn Voss a check for 3 back payments and the penalties on the 29th of September, and it cleared. Royce missed his October payment and then his November, And the bank that had told Marin to sell began quietly preparing to take the farm of the man who had done everything it had ever recommended. Then the qualified judge arrived, and in this story the judge wore the plain clothes of a grain buyer and drove a mud-spattered truck that had been everywhere a clean sedan would not go. His name was Dell, a senior buyer for a regional miller, a man who had spent 30 years learning to read standing grain the way Marin read a field, and he had been working the country roads all the ruined summer hunting the rare patches that had come through, because a miller still needs wheat and seed stock when a whole region has burned. And what is scarce is suddenly worth a great deal. He had heard the way buyers hear things at the elevator and the feed store, that the Widow Holt place west of town still had clean standing crop and saved seed worth talking about. He came in the last week of September. He did not sit in the kitchen. He walked the legume field and the wheat stubble and the grass, slow, crouching now and then to crumble the soil between his fingers and smell it, and he ran a handful of her saved seed wheat through his palm and held a few kernels up to the low sun and bit one. Then he asked her one question, the kind a man asks when he already knows the answer and only wants to hear you say it out loud. "How long has this ground been farmed like this?" Marin told him. 60 years, 3 generations. Never once broken to a single crop, never once plowed. Fence. The rotation kept unbroken through 1956 and through everything since. Dell stood a long while in that field and did not say anything at all, the kind of silence that is itself a verdict. Then he told her what he would pay for her surplus crop and her saved seed stock together, the resilient diverse seed that the whole burned region was suddenly desperate for. And he did not haggle, and he did not hedge, and the number he wrote on a slip against the hood of his truck was the verdict the bank had never been able to read. He handed her the slip, and Marin looked at it, and for a moment she said nothing, and beside her Wade said nothing, close enough to read it over her shoulder. The number landed with a weight out of all proportion to the small, torn paper it was written on. $41,000. It was more than her 3 missed payments. It was more than the whole year's note. It was, Wade understood as he stared at the figure, more than enough to do the thing that had seemed impossible at that same kitchen table in the spring. And it had come to her, not from planting more of any one thing, but from having patiently planted many. Dell folded his own copy into his shirt pocket. The old dog lay in the cut wheat stubble in the long gold light at the edge of the field. Nobody spoke for a while because some numbers do not need a word said after them, and this was one. Let me tell you what Marin did with it, because what a person does after the verdict is the truest measure of who they were all along. She did not buy a sprayer. She did not buy anything that gleamed. She paid the bank in full, and she banked the rest, and she went into the next year, careful and unchanged. In the fall of 1987, after a second steadier year had let the whole county breathe again, the bank that held Royce Temple's defaulted note finally put his 400 acres up for sale, the same clean fence-to-fence ground the modern world had admired, and the land that Glenn Voss had once sat at her table and told her to sell, Marin bought instead. She paid cash, the wheat money, and the buyer's money, and one more patient, careful year all stacked together, and she paid less than half of what Royce had owed against it, because in a county still bleeding from the drought, she was nearly the only person left with cash in hand. There is no kindness in markets, and she took none and gave none in the buying. The kindness came after. Royce sat in his truck at the edge of the drive while she signed the papers on the hood of the lawyer's car, a man of 40 watching a younger widow take the ground his family had held, and Marin did not gloat, because there was no gloat anywhere in her and never had been. When the signing was done, she walked across the gravel to his open window. She did not offer him pity, which he would not have survived. She offered him work. He could stay on, she said, and farm a share of the ground he had lost, the old way, the diversified way, if he was willing to be taught it. He looked at her a long moment. He said he would think about it. He thought about it all that winter, and in the spring he drove back up her lane and said yes, and he learned the rotation from the woman he had once told to clean up her fields, and he was in the end one of the best students she ever had, because a man who has watched his certainty burn to the ground listens harder than one who never has. And Glen Voss, the sincere man from the bank, did the thing that sincere men sometimes do when the world corrects them in front of their own eyes, which is the thing that separates a sincere man from a small one. He came out one last time that same fall of 1987, and he sat at the table where he had twice told her she was finished, and this time he brought no folder and no columns. "I read it wrong," he said. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "Twice. I sat right here and I read it exactly wrong, and I'd like to understand how if you'll show me." He was not humiliated, and Maren did not humiliate him, because humiliating a man who has come to learn only teaches him to stop coming. She poured his coffee, and she took Albert's black ledger out of the kitchen drawer and set it on the oilcloth between them, and she let Wade do the explaining. Because Wade by then spoke both languages fluently, the science he had carried home from the university and the soil he had learned at his aunt's elbow, and could move between them in a single sentence. Glen took notes in a small hand. Over the years that followed, he became known quietly, all through that part of Kansas, as the one loan officer who would write a note on a diversified operation when no other man in a necktie would, because he had seen with his own eyes at one kitchen table which kind of farm still made its payments in the year everything went wrong. The method spread the way real things spread slowly and by neighbors, and never by lecture. By the spring of 1994, other families in the county had put grass waterways back into their corn ground and worked a legume year into their rotation, not because anyone preached it to them, but because they had watched the Holt place stand green while their own burned gray. And a man will believe his own eyes long after he has stopped believing a bulletin. Maren sold seed from her own saved stock to the ones who came asking, at a fair and unfancy price, never the desperate price the drought could have let her charge. And she walked their fields with them in the cool of the mornings, the way she had once walked her own with Wade, crouching, breaking a head open, showing rather than telling. She kept her own operation right-sized, on purpose. More than once, a man came up her lane in a good suit with a proposal to help her expand, to leverage the land she now owned, free and clear, into more land, to build the thing up into an operation the farm magazines would photograph. And more than once she sent him back down the lane with his coffee barely touched. She had 800 acres after Royce's quarter, and she said, the few times anyone pressed her on it, that 800 acres was as much ground as one family could truly know by hand, and that knowing it by hand was the entire point and the only wealth that had ever kept anyone through a bad year. Wade stayed. He took over more of the place each season, and Maren taught him the last things, the things that were not in any ledger and could not be. The reading of a sky and a soil and a standing crop that lives only in a person and dies with them unless it is handed on in time. When she finally gave him Albert's black ledger to keep for good, an old man's hand and a young wife's mending and 3 generations of rainfall in it, Wade did a thing that would have pleased Albert more than anything. He added pages of his own in the back, The soil test numbers he ran now with the equipment his degree had taught him to use, confirming in laboratory figures exactly what the old man had known in his hands and his weather. The science and the soil, the two kinds of knowing, married at last inside one sewn-up notebook in a kitchen drawer. He kept a border collie, too, a young one out of Pip's last litter, and the old dog lived long enough to see the boy he had quietly converted, with 10 degrees of ground temperature, become a real farmer. Here's the thing that Summer taught, the thing worth carrying out of it. There are two kinds of knowledge in this world. There is the kind that is wide and shallow and confident, that measures what is easy to measure, that can tell you the average yield and the optimal input and the smart play. And that kind of knowledge is real and useful and runs the world in the years when nothing goes wrong. And there is the other kind, narrow and deep and patient, the kind that lives in one person's hands and one family's ground and one black ledger in a kitchen drawer, the kind that cannot tell you the average, but can tell you what happens in the worst year, because it was built by people who had lived through worst years and written down what they learned. The first kind optimizes the good year. The second kind survives the bad one. A culture that measures only what is easy to count will always mistake the first for wisdom and the second for sentiment, right up until the rain stops. Maren Holt died in 2009 on the ground she had bought back, 800 acres still farmed, the old way, the grass strips still standing, the ledger still in the drawer with Wade's pages added to Albert's. She never called herself rich, though by the only measure that mattered she was, because she owned her ground free and clear, and she had given the knowledge away to everyone willing to take it. On her last evening she sat on the porch in the late light, and the young dog, the one out of Pip's line, lay at her boot the way the old one used to. What the bank could not measure was lying right there in the grass, holding the rein, what his rigid breaks and what his patient holds. And the difference between them is the difference between a good year and a long life.